Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like now to begin our evening session, and it's always a great pleasure to introduce one's own students. And Karen Auerbach, the speaker this evening, was a student of mine at Brandeis. She came to us from Rutgers University, but she didn't come directly. She had worked as a journalist for a number of years, and while working as a journalist had come to Poland and become fascinated by Poland. And I can remember very well when I still lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, her coming to my house and saying how much she wanted to do a PhD on a Polish topic. And I'm very glad to say that I made the right decision and I accepted Karen. And she wrote her PhD on a micro-historical topic, a fascinating topic, the house on Ujazdowskie Street, number 16. This is a house which a number of people in the audience may know, where, among other people, Lena Bergman lives, Szymon Rudnicki lives. And it was a house where the majority of the people living in it were of Jewish origin and adapted in various ways in two generations to life in the People's Republic of Poland. It's a wonderful study, and it's been, I'm happy to say, translated into Polish, and it's a book that everybody should read. Karen has now moved to the University of North Carolina, and there she is now working on a new topic, which is the Jewish networks which created the involvement of Jews in publishing in Poland in the 19th century. This is another major theme. We know of the various booksellers and publishers who both published the great Polish classics of the 19th century and also made them available to a wider audience. She's also working on the information networks and the history of Yiddish in East Europe during the Holocaust. She's going to talk to us this evening on another topic related to her other research, Jewish biographies, leftist politics, and the history of emotions. And I'm very glad to welcome Karen, and we very much look forward to her speech. I should also add that after this lecture, there will be a chance to discuss the issues which she raises. Karen.
Thank you, first of all, Professor Polonsky, for that lovely introduction. It is a delight and an honor to be here today to talk with you at this conference. Thank you, first of all, to the organizers of the conference for inviting me. I should say that my great-grandparents, my father's grandparents and my father's mother were from this neighborhood, from Jelna Street and Miła Street. And my great-grandfather was a member of the Bund in Warsaw before coming to the United States. Just had a long conversation with an uncle who was a Trump voter about his grandfather and his pride in his family's Jewish socialist past, despite his current politics. Okay. I will tell you more about the conversation in a little bit. Part 1, Jews, Leftist Politics, and the History of Emotion, an Introduction. Can you hear me okay? Okay. In July 1959, the Marxist philosopher Emil Adler sat down at his desk in Warsaw and addressed a handwritten letter to his only son, Marian, who was approaching his 12th birthday. As Emil remembered his son's birth in the aftermath of the Holocaust, his thoughts turned to his own childhood in a traditional Jewish home in early 20th century Galicia, and to the chasm that separated his young son from the vanished world of Emil's pre-war family. Despite the handful of Hebrew grammar books interspersed among the Polish literature and works of leftist political ideology on the family's bookshelves, despite Emil's insistence on retaining his non-Polish sounding last name and passing it on to his children, his post-war family's distance from the Jewish past had created a blank spot that separated his son Marian and daughter Halina from the way of life which had defined Emil Adler's pre-war childhood. On Emil Adler's own 12th birthday, nearly a half-century earlier, His father had begun to prepare him for the bar mitzvah ceremony. Now, in 1956, with the traditional Jewish marker of his son Marion's adulthood looming just a year away, Emil began to rethink the spirit in which he and his wife Genya, a survivor of Auschwitz, were raising their children, who did not have any understanding of the Jewish traditions which had linked Emil and Genya Adler to their own parents and grandparents. The words that came to Emil Adler on his son's birthday in Warsaw of 1959 maintained an atheist's rejection of Emil's childhood faith, but seek nevertheless to fill in those blank spots. Underlying the letter's sentiments are the ambiguities and ambivalence of a Communist Party member of Jewish background in post-Holocaust Poland, whose longing for his vanished childhood home and murdered family was intertwined with recollections of the traditional Jewish world which he had long since left behind. In my talk this evening, I would like to revisit the ambiguities, ambivalence, and contradictions of Emil Adler's life path and the interplay between the political and the personal in the lives of other leftists of Jewish background of his generation, through the approach of the history of emotions, with a focus on belonging as a way to help us understand political identifications and decisions. I would like to ask how we as historians can draw on reconstructions of individual life paths, that is, on biography, both individual biographies and collective biographies, to access commonalities and variations in mindsets and frameworks of belonging at times of changing ideas about what binds individuals to broader political, social, and cultural communities. I would like to argue that what drew Emil Adler and others of Jewish background to communism and other leftist political circles was the mutually reinforcing interplay between two kinds of belonging. One, a sense of being at home in their circles of activists, that is, an emotional attachment, what one scholar of the history of emotions has called a personal, intimate, private sentiment of place attachment, which is built up and grows out of everyday practices. And the other, a conception of belonging that redefined what connected individuals to a community, that is, a political conception of citizenship. In his letter, Emil Adler sought both to reconcile these two aspects of his life path and worldview, and to explain them to his son. From the first sentences of the letter that Emil addressed to Marion on the 29th of July, 1959, the father seeks to connect his son to the memory of Emil's pre-war family. The father initially hesitates, however, in emphasizing the specifically Jewish past that eventually emerges as his reason for writing. At first, he describes only his first meeting with his son, first meeting being in quotes, 12 years earlier, in a hospital on the right bank of Warsaw, where he was able to pick out the infant Marion from the sea of newborns because you were so similar, he wrote, to my father. He continues, on that day, the 29th of July, you were a few hours, perhaps a few dozen hours, into the first year of your life. Today, the 29th of July, 1959, you have already reached or begun the 13th year. Today, you are a few hours, a few dozen hours into your 13th year. And then Emil Adler, a pre-war communist who was a founding editor of Marxist-Leninist literature for the party's post-war publishing house, Książka I Wiedza, Book and Knowledge, broaches his main reason for writing. In a 4-page letter, he tries to make up for the previous 12 years in which Jewishness had meant for his son Marion only a sign of difference, a vague understanding of where his parents came from and why they had lost so much in wartime. Emil wrote, and I'll quote here extensively from his letter, 13, this number is treated differently by various nations. Some consider it to be an unfortunate rite of passage, some otherwise. In any case, it is not possible to experience the 13th year with indifference. An interesting date is, for example, the 13th year of life for Jewish children. For them, in the 13th year, a new period of life begins. By new, I mean here mature, more serious. I will describe to you how this, his 13th year, was with me. My parents were believing people, believing Jews, and they raised me in the Jewish tradition. According to this tradition, the age of childhood ends with the 12th year. For 12 years, the father takes upon himself, and this is still quoting Emil Adler's letter, all the sins arising from the behavior of the child. In parentheses, he wrote, a son, a girl, this is another matter. And when the boy reaches the 13th year, the father brings a prayer to God and says, Baruch shepatreni, which means, and this is his translation, blessed are you who liberated me. And so he withdraws from responsibility for his son. The boy receives the liturgical vestments, the so-called tefillin, and then his explanation of tefillin. It's his explanation, boxes made of leather containing the basic prayer written on parchment, which he puts on daily from now until the end of life for the morning prayer, takes part in fasts, very difficult and rigorous among Jews, he writes parenthetically, and in other rituals. The rituals are like rituals always are. Every religion has its own, and for as long as they are believed in, they exert influence. End quote. Emil then continues with a passage that refers to his own struggle to make his Jewish past relevant to his secular worldview and his leftist politics, despite his childhood loss of faith and eventual turn to communism. He emphasizes to Marian a humanistic interpretation of Judaism, which he judges to be compatible not only with his own atheism and political ideology, but also with the secular nature of his son Marian's upbringing. Quoting again from the letter, in Emil's voice, this is how it was with me. Then came education, knowledge, and all of those fairy tales and myths were cast off into a corner. But one thing in all of this is worthy of attention, and this is why I have described these things to you. Remember that I experienced my 13th birthday very deeply, that he himself is associating, is emphasizing the emotions. The meaning here for Emil seems to be in the emotion of the experience. I think to myself, dear little son, that you were raised in a secular spirit without any superstitious formulas. But I also think that from the various traditions, we should keep from the discarded myths that which is true and sensible in them. In this case, I believe that the sensible thing is the feeling of responsibility which should accompany a 13-year-old. On these days, when I went through them, when the 13th year of life began, it was the feeling, the emotion, that a new period was beginning in my life, when I will be responsible for myself. At that time, I saw this responsibility through the eyes of a stupefied boy, first of all as a responsibility in the face of God. But on a daily basis, this meant responsibility for actions concerning people, and in reality, when I was 13 years old, I already felt serious, adult, in short, responsible. You should think about this, reflect over how your greater maturity and responsibility will manifest itself from this moment on. This will be responsibility not in the face of God, but significantly more difficult in the face of people. It is not the Lord God, Panbug, who will judge your results, but people. End quote. Despite the nostalgic and philosophic references to the traditional Jewish world of his youth, Emil refers to Marian in closing not only as his son and friend, but also his comrade. Okay. Part 2, Paths to Leftist Politics. Emil Adler, his wife Genya, and their 2 children were among families of Jewish background who were neighbors in one apartment building in Warsaw after the Second World War at Ujazdowskie 16. The clustering of these families in a building, of these 10 families in a building with just over 23 apartments, resulted from the clustering of Jewish employees in the Polish Communist Party's post-war publishing house, Książka I Wiedza, initially just Książka, which had been assigned the building for its employees. The involvement of the parents in these families in press and publishing institutions in post-war Poland developed in part from pre-war political and publishing activities. Nearly half of the 19 parents who were of Jewish background at Ujazdowskie 16 after the Second World War were pre-war Communist Party members. Another 3 became members of the reconstructed party at the end of the Second World War, and 1 was a member of a communist youth organization but never joined the post-war party. The political cauldron of Poland between the world wars was the stage on which the parents of Jewish background who lived after the war in this building began their young adulthoods. For 8 of the 19 parents, illegal communist politics consumed their lives before the deluge of the Second World War. But they followed various paths to radicalism. 6 of the communist parents came from working-class families, while 2 others who joined the party before the war grew up in middle-class, Polonized homes, and they embraced an ideology that rebelled against their parents' bourgeois world. These parents were among only a minority of Jews who turned to communism in the fraught political climate of interwar Poland, and the anti-Semitic stereotype of Żydokomuna, which has blamed Jews for communism both before and after the Second World War, and still does, has greatly exaggerated Jewish involvement in communist parties. Yet the concentration of employees of Jewish background at the post-war party's ideological publishing house, Książka i Wiedza, is rooted in the fact that most pre-war communists in charge of publishing and distributing propaganda in the party were of Jewish background, that is, the publishing and propaganda apparatus specifically. When the printed word became a tool of government control after the war, the communist authorities initially viewed communist intellectuals in publishing and press institutions, among them a disproportionate number of individuals of Jewish background, only some of whom identified as Jews, as playing an important role in the party's consolidation of power over the country. Before the Second World War, communists from Jewish families shared with other young Polish Jews the experiences that helped to define their generation: the political turmoil of interwar Poland, increasing secularization that left many Jews searching for new communities, and coming of age at a time when anti-Semitism was an increasing presence. Why a disproportionate number of Jews and individuals of Jewish background turned to communism and other leftist political parties in this atmosphere has been much debated by historians, including by many of you in this room. Communism's promise to uproot identity from attachment to land and national background would likely have been an attractive idea for Jews who struggled with the label of other in a country to which they felt they belonged. And class ideology must have been an important element for those who came from poorer families and working families that struggled to get by. Now, some historians have posited that Judaism imbued in Jews a messianic worldview that drew a minority to the utopian ethos of communism. But as Jack Jacobs has pointed out, the argument that there is something inherent in Judaism that made leftist politics attractive to Jews is undermined by the relative decline of Jewish involvement in leftist politics. It would also have to explain my uncle's Trumpist politics and other minority, but a significant minority of Jewish voters in the United States support Trump and others who were clearly on the other side of the political aisle from leftist politics. To quote Jack Jacobs, the relationship of Jews to the left was historically contingent, specific to political, historic, and economic conditions that prevailed between the late 19th and mid-20th century in Europe. Rather, as Jacobs argues, Isaac Deutscher's explanation, and quoting Jacobs, for the one-time link between Jews and the left, the fact that it is colored by his political sympathies notwithstanding, that is, Deutscher's political sympathies notwithstanding, has a great deal of merit. Jews were regularly marginal to the societies in which they lived when the left came into being, and in the era during which it developed. Anti-Semitism made it possible for Jews in many European lands to break into any number of powerful institutions. Jewish marginality and the political, economic, and sociological conditions that existed in the 19th century and 20th century, and that fostered marginality, clarified the political inclinations of any number of prominent leftists of earlier generations, end quote. Now, Jews were certainly not the only marginal group attracted disproportionately to communism in interwar Poland, and many pre-war communists were unlikely to have attributed their political radicalization to anti-Semitism. According to their ideology, national and religious background was supposed to lose importance as the utopian vision of socialism became a reality. When one pre-war party member who became a communist in his early teens and who lived at Ujazdowskie 16 after the Second World War, looked back on his life from the perspective of old age, he insisted that anti-Semitism was not the cause of his turn to communism. Yet, just a few moments after he made that statement, in speaking with a radio interviewer, this same man commented that a 1919 pogrom in his native city had helped to shape his worldview. In fact, it was later that same year of 1919 when he joined the Communist Party. One of his neighbors at Ujazdowskie 16 after the war, on the other hand, Stefania Fedecka, a native of Lublin, did not hesitate in a 1996 interview with the Shoah Foundation, the Steven Spielberg's collection of testimonies from Holocaust survivors. She did not hesitate in that interview to explain how her experiences as a Jew drew her toward leftist politics in her youth. Stefania Fedecka was a name that she used to survive, a so-called Aryan name that she used to survive on the surface during the Second World War, but she retained that name until her death a number of years ago. Fedecka grew up in what she later described as a half-assimilated, well-to-do family, and although she never joined the Communist Party before the war, she had a glimpse of political intrigue while still in secondary school. The experience that stood out in her memory was sneaking into the coat room at school to stuff propaganda leaflets into the pockets of her classmates' coats. Fedecka's friends from leftist circles were almost entirely Jewish, she remembered in that interview when she was 77 years old. Which is entirely understandable, she commented. As a student at a journalism school in Warsaw in the 1930s, Fedecka recalled, only one professor signaled his dissent with a brief silence when some students intimidated their Jewish peers into standing in the back of his class. I was forced to stand during lectures, Fedecka recalled in that interview. I did not find any non-Jews who came to us during breaks. No one showed sympathy to those who were suffering. Suffering for what exactly? For the fact that we were born Jews. Now, it's both important to remember her looking back, right? What she remembers and doesn't remember is, of course, shaped by her experiences in the intervening years. But what she remembers, at least in looking back at age 77, is that there were no non-Jews who expressed any solidarity with her. Another post-war neighbor of Stefania Fedecka, Ignacy Krutz, took a different path to communism. The son of a grocer in Praga, Krutz watched his siblings emigrate one by one as they escaped from limited economic prospects to Western Europe in the 1920s and 1930s. Krutz stayed behind, cutting short his education to work in his father's small grocery store. Like other post-war residents and others whom I interviewed beyond the circle that lived in that building, Krutz was drawn to conspiratorial communist circles early on. By 15, he was already a foot soldier in the party as he and his peers took charge of distributing political leaflets that older comrades printed on party presses. Krutz and his friends risked prison as they handed out flyers to workers at factories, the unemployed on Praga streets, and young people in front of libraries. They hid piles of leaflets in Krutz's neighborhood with a janitor near a theater or in other secret locations. In conspiratorial meetings in the apartments of one or another of his comrades, the young communists of right bank Warsaw, many of them from poor and working class families, and stymied in their hopes for further education, sought to satiate their hunger for knowledge, as Krutz later recalled. They read literature, economic news, and political journals in a, quoting Krutz, kind of ideological school of the youth who were fervently drawn at that time to knowledge. Krutz was still 15 when he served his first prison sentence. The dangers that communists faced as members of an illegal party drew them into close, intimate circles, and romance flourished together with political passion. Ignacy Krutz began his family in this intimate atmosphere, meeting his wife, Stanisława Spiegelman, in the capital's communist underground. 5 years younger than her husband, Spiegelman also became involved in politics as an adolescent, but she turned only gradual to communism. As with many young Jews in interwar Poland, where youth organizations of secular political parties created new communities as the bonds of religious observance weakened, Spiegelman drifted from one political ideology to the next. At 11, she joined a left-wing Zionist youth movement before switching to the Polish Socialist Party, and in her late teens, she took up the more radical politics of communism. Her life played out on the opposite side of the Wisła from her future husband, Ignacy Krutz's childhood home. In Moranów, Spiegelman studied nursing at the Burson and Bauman Jewish Children's Hospital. She made trouble for the hospital administration as she earned her party stripes by organizing strikes among the nurses. Like Krutz, she traveled to factories around Warsaw, distributing communist propaganda leaflets. If communism's class ideology attracted working class and poorer youth, then the communism of assimilating young Jews from wealthier families was rooted in different soil. Long before the parents I wrote about were old enough to read political literature, and before nearly all of them were born, Max Horwitz, one of the founders of the Communist Party of Poland and the descendant of a well-off assimilated Jewish family, made clear that his ideology was rooted in his experience as a Jew who had sought to leave behind his Jewish identity, only to have his identity as a Pole rejected. Assimilation, he wrote in 1905 in a pamphlet titled The Jewish Question, was the bankrupt ideology, quoting this pamphlet, of the Jewish bourgeoisie and intelligentsia. A Jew, in order to become a person, had to stop being a Jew to become entirely a Pole to the point of illusion, end quote. Horwitz sought to escape from his Jewish background not by continuing to immerse himself in the Polish culture in which he was raised, but by creating a new society that sought to break the bonds of nation and state, which excluded him. Ernest Phalke, who lived at Ujazdowskie 16 for more than a half century after the Second World War, might not have explained his politics through his Jewish background, as Max Horwitz did, but his own path to communism rebelled against a similarly privileged background. He was the son of a lawyer in Stanisławów and spent his earliest years in Vienna, to which the family had fled during the First World War, and he took up radical politics while studying law at Jagiellonian University in Kraków. While working in his father's law office in Stanisławów, he was also organizing the illegal press and propaganda of the Communist Party of Western Ukraine, which, like its Western Belarusian counterpart, was formerly part of the Communist Party of Poland. Phalke's conspiratorial work as director of the party's propaganda section in that city might have brought him into contact with one of his post-war neighbors, Emil Adler, who traveled to Stanisławów to establish connections with political comrades there. One can imagine the disappointment of Phalke's father when his son was arrested in 1935 and sentenced to 7 years in prison with other party members in connection with the printing of illegal political leaflets. After Phalke's arrest, his new wife, Salomea, a pediatrician, was held in a solitary cell for weeks because of her husband's politics. Salomea Phalke moved to Warsaw after she was released, away from the tenuous situation in her hometown of Stanisławów, and found work in a Jewish hospital while her husband remained in prison. 4 years later, she took the train in the opposite direction, rushing back to Stanisławów as the Second World War began. Part 3, Politics and the History of Emotions. When I first began writing about the families of Ujazdowskie XVI under Professor Polansky's guidance, I reconstructed the details of their lives before, during, and after the Second World War to examine the evolution of identity and community across generations in order to understand the process of assimilation and its limits. I defined identity at that time as an individual's relationship to one's country, one's family, religion, surrounding society, the political system, culture. From the vantage point of Ujazdowskie XVI, I argued that we could observe the interplay between private life and broader circumstances of time and place in shaping identity and community. Emerging in the family's lives were commonalities in how individuals were shaped by the surroundings in which private life plays out. Rising to the surface was the accumulation of decisions by minor actors who determine the details of history, but also the influence of history writ large on what decisions an individual makes, often in a way that is invisible to those who are living that history. But a challenge I encountered in presenting my research was that the term identity was, much to my initial surprise, considered problematic and essentializing. I was told I should not use the term identity. Identity, of course, is not static. The formation and reformation of identity are a continual process, one that is far from linear. It's exactly what I was writing about, is the constant evolution and recreation of self and identity and community. It was suggested that I use the word identification, which emphasizes process and contingency over result, and emphasizes the lack of static, emphasizes sort of fluidity. But that seemed too simplistic a solution. At that time, the word belonging was coming into vogue in scholarship about what we once would have termed identity. But as several scholars have pointed out, belonging is usually used as a synonym of collective identity or citizenship, overused to the point that it too, like the word identity that it replaced, has lost its import as a meaningful term of analysis. Marko Antosic and others have noted that scholarship tends to identify two types of belonging: place belonging, kind of at homeness, and the politics of belonging, often used interchangeably with citizenship, but that scholarship generally neglects the former, that is, the sort of process of the formation of a sense of belonging to place and not necessarily a physical place. But that scholarship generally neglects the former, that is, the idea of place belonging in practice. Employing the term belonging in the framework of the history of emotions and viewing the subjects of my study as what historians of emotions refer to as an emotional community offers a way to understand their life paths without forcing one to find rationality in contradictions and ambiguities. I found myself trying to solve contradictions in their lives and worldviews that I realized just existed, that people live with contradictions in their worldviews. In fact, the field of the history of emotions was shaped by attempts to explain the attraction of political ideologies. Although historians and philosophers have, for centuries, paid attention to emotions, the field of the history of emotions was born with an article published in 1941 by Lucien Febvre in the Annales, the French journal he founded together with Marc Bloch, based on a 1938 conference paper in which, to cite the German historian Jan Plamper, Febvre argued that historians already include emotions in their histories, except that they did so in an unconscious and anachronistic manner, imposing ideas of emotions drawn from their own time on former periods, without considering whether there might have been a shift in conceptions related to any one feeling in the meantime. Febvre appealed in his 1941 essay especially for the study of emotions, particularly negative emotions, hate, fear, cruelty, in the study of mass politics. To quote Plamper, who has written extensively about the history of emotions, The threat of European fascism and the seductive emotional potential of National Socialism, that is Nazism, prompted Febvre's approach, end quote. Historians answered his call in subsequent decades to some degree. For example, one monumental work, A History of French Passions by Theodore Zeldin, the British historian Theodore Zeldin, which focuses on the period from 1848 to 1945, was a work of social history published in the 1970s when social history was really taking precedence. And it examined 6 passions: ambition, love, anger, pride, taste, and anxiety. The book focused more on private life over politics, but has relevance, I think, for our own topic. In it, Zeldin examined, quote, the emotional consequences of the individuals searching for meaning in an era of individualism, where the foundations once provided by religion, family, and village no longer bound the social fabric together, end quote. According to Plamper, it was the attacks of September 11th, 2001, which I think was a week after I started grad school, and their political aftermath that led to a global explosion in research on the history of emotions. That is, the history of emotions in the past 20 years has exploded with research groups all over the world. And I'd like to emphasize that Febvre's programmatic article and my own understanding of the history of emotions calls for a social history of political involvement, not a psychohistory, which is a different kind of approach to history. In rereading the scholarship about Jews in the left, after immersing myself in scholarship about the history of emotions, I was struck by how often the former invokes emotions, especially the feeling of belonging in the sense of at-homeness, in explaining the attraction of some Jews to leftist political movements. To cite just one brief example, Jeff Schatz, who I think is here, refers to the, quoting him, intellectual and emotional traits that developed in the course of their becoming mature members of the communist movement, a process that reached a peak during prison sentences. And Schatz emphasizes the importance of prison sentences, of the experience of serving in prison, serving time in prison in their sort of political maturity, and a sort of emotional feeling of belonging through myths and songs about heroes of Jewish origin, secrecy and discipline, code words, all really played a part in forming a kind of emotional community in which Schatz emphasizes the importance of prison sentences as part of sort of emotional maturity in the movement. Okay. So the history of emotions offers us, I think, all kinds of possibilities for opening up the question of why some Jews were drawn to leftist political movements, including communism. And I think that, as Professor Polański mentioned at the beginning in his introduction, that I'm currently working on Jewish publishers of Polish literature in the 19th century. They were far from being communist or leftist. But I've been working with diaries, one diary in particular, in which I'm sort of trying to get into the mindset of individuals, in particular a young woman at the end of the 19th century, the last years of the 19th century. And I found really useful the concept of a Dutch historian, Johan Huizinga. I'm not pronouncing his last name correctly, but he used the term historical sensation, which I sort of translate in my head to mindset, trying to get inside sort of the mindset of individuals at the time that they were writing, to understand sort of their emotional makeup and the way in which their emotional makeup and mindset shapes decisions and shapes their life paths. And I think that we can do the same for sort of re-looking at memoirs and diaries, looking at what emotions the politics of the left responded to, what emotions the politics of the left sort of not responded to, but sort of satisfied, looking at what kind of vocabulary political propaganda of the left used to see sort of the emotional language of politics at the time. I think that the sort of the history of emotions, including but not limited to the idea of belonging as sort of an emotional, as a feeling, can help us understand Jewish involvement in leftist politics beyond beyond economic and political and sort of intellectual history. not as a replacement of it, but sort of in addition to it, and sort of an expansion of our understanding. Part 4, post-war paths and disillusionment. The post-war lives of the Jewish parents at Ujazdowskie 16 are replete with contradictions. And I've come to accept these contradictions without trying to resolve them. The majority of them were internationalists, yet through their publishing work, they were immersed in the Polish word and in Polish culture. They were distanced from post-war Jewish institutions, yet they lived in a building where nearly half of their neighbors were of Jewish background. Despite the parents' integration into Polish culture, both before and after the Second World War to greater or lesser degree, and despite their internationalism, their association with communism prevented the parents' social integration. One resident of Ujazdowskie 16, who moved there later in the 1970s, and whose father was a pre-war communist, referred to his parents' social circles as the Jewish communist intellectual ghetto. It was only in the generation of the children, that is, those who grew up in this building or whose parents who grew up, who were born during or right after the Second World War, it was only in that generation of children that the parents' cultural integration, and in some cases the parents' ideology, led to social integration, at least among the families that remained in Poland after the emigration wave of 1968 to 1970. From early on in post-war Poland, the stereotype of, quote, Jewish dominance in the Polish communist regime significantly affected these families. Their marginalization, partly resulting from the marginalization of Książka i Wiedza within the party, that is, the publishing house that several of them still worked for, began by the end of the first post-war decade. For the parents who were pre-war party members, the revelations and political upheavals of 1956 were a turning point in both their political disillusionment and the place of the Jewish past within their family lives. And I'd say disillusionment and perhaps loneliness are two emotions that if I were to rewrite this history today with this lens of the history of emotions, are the two feelings that I would explore in reading these documents. Emil Adler's letter to his son in July 1959, that I began with its ruminations on the Jewish past, hints at the significance of the year 1956 and its aftermath in the post-war paths of a generation of Jews and individuals of Jewish background in Poland, particularly the minority who were communists. For the first post-war decade, Emil Adler and other pre-war communists, both Jewish and non-Jewish, had placed their faith in a government they expected would realize the utopian political ideals of radical equality and internationalism for which they had been imprisoned in pre-war Poland. Yet Marian Adler's 12th birthday came less than 3 years after a tumultuous period of political upheaval in Eastern Europe, East Central Europe, and the Soviet Union, from Moscow to Warsaw to Budapest, which left some pre-war communists struggling with the gap between their ideology and the repressive post-war political reality of Stalinist Poland. Emil Adler was himself a Stalinist, having attended a party school in the Soviet Union in 1950 with other Marxist philosophers. And among Adler's personal papers are typically praise-filled poems in Yiddish and Polish about Stalin. For Emil Adler and others from Jewish families who were pre-war communists, the open resurgence of nationalist and anti-Semitic sentiment in the Communist Party in Poland and within some segments of Polish society in the wake of the political events of 1956 deepened the seeds of questioning over the possibility of realizing their political ideals. The years immediately following 56 were a particularly difficult transitional period when political faith was challenged, social circles and families were disrupted by emigration, and the possibility of full integration, full acceptance into post-war Polish society was called into question. The 1956 events and their aftermath exposed the contradictions in the life paths of Polish Jewish communists and communists of Jewish background. Before the Second World War, their internationalist ideology had promised the possibility of becoming full members in the societies of modern Europe, at a time when the political states established on the embers of the former empires of East Central Europe were increasingly defining themselves according to the principles of ethnic nationalism. In the early years after the Second World War, these individuals cast their hopes with an ideology that they had hoped would prevail over nationalism and would create a new society that could include them as equal members. Jews and non-Jews alike who were building the communist government continued in the first post-war decade to maintain faith in the possibility of transforming surrounding society. Opposition to the communist government among the Polish masses, anti-Jewish violence in the early aftermath of the Holocaust, and the continued strength of the Catholic Church in post-war Poland were explained as part of the reaction, which was expected and predetermined by the historical process. Socialist propaganda and education, communists believed, would allow human nature to transcend these national and religious divisions. The work of the residents at Ujazdowskie 16 in the party publishing house and other publishing institutions was intended to spread that ideology. Now, neither Emil Adler nor the other post-war residents of Jewish background at Ujazdowskie 16 publicly voiced disillusionment in 1956 or in the following decade. Adler's letter to his son, Emil Adler's letter to his son in 1959, however, provides a glimpse of a certain shift in mindset. I would say shift in kind of a historical sensation is the term that I've come to use from Johann Huizinga, from the early post-war years regarding the Jewish past. Reaction to the political upheavals of 1956 included a reconsideration of what he had sacrificed as a Jew for a party and a government that was gradually pushing him and his peers to the margins, even then, while playing on nationalist sentiments to gain popular legitimacy. In 1956, the dissonance between the party's propaganda of equality and the continued stigma of one's Jewish background, even within the party itself, pointed to the system's broader falsification of reality and of the ideals it purported to support. By that year, it was already becoming evident to some Jewish survivors in post-war Poland, both communist and non-communist, that what those of Jewish background had left behind before and after the Second World War in exchange for full membership, full acceptance in surrounding society had not had the desired effect. It was as if the bargain of Jewish emancipation had been entered into once again and had not been upheld. The political upheavals in 1956 impacted each of the families I studied to varying degrees, resulting in changes on 3 levels. As Poles living in a society emerging from the repressive Stalinist years, for some of these families as pre-war Communist Party members or sympathizers coming to grips with the reality of the post-war system that they had helped to create, and as Jews at a time when resurgent Polish nationalism led to an upsurge in anti-Semitism. On all 3 levels, the family's Jewish background was an important factor in shaping the ways in which the changes affected them, as well as their responses to these developments. It was in 1956 and the years immediately afterward when the freer political atmosphere in Poland allowed some of the parents at Ujazdowskie 16 to give greater expression to their Jewish background to greater or lesser degree as an organic part of their family lives. These expressions took place in the personal sphere, even as political disillusionment was growing among several parents who were longtime communists and whose Jewish background had contributed to the shaping of their political ideology. For those residents at Ujazdowskie 16 who had been pre-war communists, the events of 1956 affected them first and foremost as committed political activists who had dedicated both their pre-war lives and the first post-war decade to publishing and propaganda work in support of the Communist Party. From their earliest years in the aftermath of the Holocaust, they had rebuilt their professional and personal lives around their political ideals. Emil Adler, looking back in 1962 at the establishment of Książka, the publishing house that then absorbed, that was the Communist Party publishing house that then absorbed the Socialist Party publishing house to become Książka I Wiedza, recalled the sense of expectation among the circles of pre-war communists who gathered in Książka's editorial offices in 1945 and 46. A reminiscence, to be sure, that is likely an idealized view of these early years. Emil Adler wrote, in May 1945, in spacious, sparsely populated rooms of the editorial offices on Książka, on Piotrkowska Street in Łódź, the pulse of large-scale publishing work was still not felt. The handful of old, meaning pre-war Książka workers, and the first workers from among the comrades, returning from the dispersal of occupation, everyone carried on as if in expectation of a major order, which would arise from the new doings of the party and the people's authorities, end quote. In those early Łódź years, the publishing house's employees, isolated from larger society, either because of Jewish background or because of their association with the unpopular communist authorities, or for both reasons, became a close-knit group who worked and socialized together in the publishing house's offices and in the shared apartments which the publishing house had allocated to them. That is, initially in Łódź, there were shared apartments before they moved to Warsaw. According to Adler's reminiscences, the early Książka circles included intellectuals and linotypists, party and non-party members, who shared, quote, more than one joint moment at work and play, especially during our small celebrations, which are documented to this day by preserved photographs at which this group was gathered at tables set with food and drink, end quote. Among Jewish survivors starting life anew, political comrades became both social circle and family in the early post-war period, connections that were often maintained for decades, disrupted only by the emigration waves of 1956 and the aftermath, and 1968 to 1970. That is, they formed a kind of emotional community. The strong connections between personal and political life meant that shifts in political winds affected home lives to an even greater degree than among many other families in post-war Poland. As individuals of Jewish background, meanwhile, anti-Semitism during periods of political upheaval underscored the gap between political ideology and reality in a way that affected them more personally than other families in Poland. In 1956, the parents' generation, the generation of parents in the families I wrote about, was reacting to the political upheavals on both the personal and political levels, just as their children, most of them born during or just after the Second World War, were reaching an age when they were beginning to understand and question their surroundings. Their parents' political questioning and greater openness in expression in 1956 took place as the children were beginning to develop their own worldviews. Among Jewish families in post-war Warsaw, where the parents were pre-war communists, the intrusion of political ideology into the family's homes took place at the same time as the parents were beginning a gradual process of political disillusionment in the 1950s and 60s. The continued marginalization of parents as Jews in the decade after 56, in a political system whose slogans asserted equality, regardless of religious or national background, undermined the politicized aspect of home lives and the suppression to greater or lesser degree of their Jewish background. Among communist parents, meanwhile, final proof in 67 and 68 of the bankruptcy of a political system to which they had committed much of their adult lives led some of them to return to connections with their Jewish background and with the Jewish institutions of post-war Poland. Emil Adler and his wife Genia, who had moved to Platz Narodowice in the early 1950s and had lived there for more than a decade before their emigration from Poland in 1968, left first for Vienna in 1968 before settling permanently in Göttingen, Germany, where the parents lived out their lives in a home across the street from the Goethe Institute. Genia Adler, a survivor of Auschwitz and other camps, found solace among her young German colleagues in the publishing house where she worked there, despite frequent nightmares, while Emil taught at the university and continued to write about Herder, whom he had started to write about before the Second World War. They became lay leaders of the local synagogue, and Emil began reading a passage each day from a small Hebrew Bible. 47 years after Emil Adler wrote that letter to his son Marian on the latter's 12th birthday, Marian Adler, living in Göttingen, Germany, with his German wife, but still longing for Poland, did not recall receiving the letter which his father had written to him as he began his 13th year of life. In 2006, a decade after his father's death, Marian still had not looked through the piles of letters, papers, and photographs that his parents had left behind. He kept standing outside of the room that I was reading the papers in, asking me if I had found anything. And he seemed to be concerned about what I would find about his father. Even as an adult, Marian did not realize, after reading this letter, that the reason for his father's sentiments was to explain the preparations for a bar mitzvah, which he would not have. At age 12, because the letter did not use the term bar mitzvah, but to anyone who's familiar with any rituals of the bar mitzvah, it's clearly what his father was referring to. At age 12 and at age 59, Marian would not have had any frame of reference for understanding his father's intentions. Although Marian had been aware of his Jewish identity from early childhood, and I'm talking again about Emil Adler's son, neither the thoroughly secular home in which he and his sister were raised, nor their education in Polish schools provided markers for understanding the substance of that identity, its connection with religious traditions, or the rituals and practices of their parents' pre-war Jewish homes. This absence created the very barrier against the past that Emil Adler himself had cautioned his wife not to erect. In a letter he wrote to Genya, the mother in this family, in 1946 about his childhood. Everything else is already passing, Adler wrote in 1946 to his wife, but loneliness leads one to dwell on various things. Thoughts come back about my brothers, my parents. Categorically, dear baby, one should not allow a separation from such experiences. Adler's letter to his wife went on to describe a vacation his mother had taken him on when he was 4 years old, and a photograph that was taken during the trip. Always when we look at this picture, we remembered the events of the trip, which remain in my memory in all of their detail, he wrote. Not even one photo. I'm certain that if I go to Brody, where he was from, where he had grown up, I would find a few pictures there. I'm thinking seriously about a trip there, even more so because it is necessary to sell my home. In post-war Poland, Emil Adler's writings had echoed with the traditions of 19th century German Jewish thought, which clung to the rationalist and humanist ideals of the German Enlightenment, even after many other Germans themselves, had begun to imbue these ideals with romantic nationalism. Adler grappled in his writings with the relationship between the state and the individual, between religion and state, and between the nation and religion. Just as these preoccupations among German Jewish thinkers have been rooted in the German Jewish experience of a gradual and tumultuous process of emancipation in the 19th century, a similar focus by Adler can be seen as rooted in the 20th century experiences of Polish Jews and of European Jews more broadly in the interwar period and during the Second World War. And just as, quoting Michael Brenner, German Jews probably had stronger ties to 19th century German liberalism than most other segments of the German population, because their legal equality and acceptance in German society depended to a large extent on the success of liberal politics. Communists, end quote from Michael Brenner, communists of Jewish background who remained in post-war Poland were more invested than others in a post-war political system that sought to weaken exclusionary ethnic nationalism, which was a barrier to the integration of Jews and other minorities into the Polish state, nation, and society. In 1965, however, while still living in Poland, Emil Adler published a book about Herder and the German Enlightenment, in which Adler argues that Herder's embrace of the national idea, quoting him, does not necessarily exclude faith and universalism. The subject that Adler chose to analyze reflects the political questioning of a pre-war communist who was clearly struggling with both Jewish integration, the issue of Jewish integration, and a flagging faith in internationalism. Later, after leaving Poland and while living in Göttingen, Emil penciled in an entry, Jews, into the book's table of contents. He probably made the penciled addition around the time of the fall of communism in Poland in 1989, a year that was written in pencil elsewhere in the book. Perhaps Emil hoped to republish the work in an uncensored version in a free Poland. The passage to which the added entry refers describes Herder's analysis of German Jews' struggle for emancipation from the mid-18th century through the 19th century. Herder, Adler wrote in the mid-1960s while still living in Poland, argues that a state's treatment of its Jews is a barometer for the country's broader ideals, and that a state that does not find a place for its Jews is discredited in the eyes of all its residents. And I would say that is the case for the treatment of other religious, ethnic, national minorities in the United States and elsewhere today. One can find a comment I made to my uncle, my Trumpist uncle, and he didn't like that. One can find significance in the fact that although Emil penciled Jews into the table of contents only in 1989, the analysis which the entry points to was present even in 1965. In the passage Adler wrote, the idea of humanity, despite its universal foundations, does not exclude, but rather establishes the simultaneous development of the national idea, whose foremost proponent in the German Enlightenment was Herder. An argument in favor of the practical political role of the idea of humanity is its application to the Jewish problem. And this is quoting Emil Adler. Conversion of the Jews, published in the 7th issue of a journal Adrastia in 1802, and therefore in the year before the writer's death, testifies to the fact that Herder, as Heim correctly states, and again I'm quoting Adler in his book, from his book, is more multifaceted, more moderate, and more historical even than Lessing, who expressed through his Nathan the Wise fundamental points in the German Jews' aspirations for emancipation. Herder's final conclusion is this: Palestine should be for Jews those countries in which they live and work. All laws that treat Jews worse than cattle do not favor their least trust, and I'm continuing to quote Emil Adler here about Herder. And in this manner, every day, every hour, defame them in all eyes, are testimony to the unremitting barbarism of this state, which tolerates such laws from barbaric times, writes Herder, quoting Adler, not leaving the least doubt about which kind of state this is about above all. The style of debate lively recalls his full polemical passion derived from the Sturm und Drang period. Who, when reading the philosophical writings of Spinoza, Mendelssohn, Hertz, would arrive at the thought that Jews wrote them? The community of culture, Herder adds, unites people of all times, countries, and nations. And then this is the final part of Adler's, a quote from Adler's book. Let us remember that this was written in a time when in Germany discriminatory edicts toward Jews were still in place, and Mendelssohn, as a young boy, was helpless before the Rosenthal Gate of Berlin, the only one through which Jews were allowed to enter the city, because he did not have money to pay the humiliating Jewish tax, end quote. Although the book addresses 19th century Germany, Emil Adler might have been writing indirectly about the national idea, both in 20th century Poland and in Jewish thought more broadly. When read in light of Emil Adler's letter to his son on his son Marion's 12th birthday 6 years earlier, that passage about Herder can be seen as reflecting Adler's own personal struggle to integrate his identification with his Jewish past or his feeling of belonging to Jewish past or Jewish community, sort of an intangible community, into his political faith in universalism and sense of belonging to Poland at a time when Jews in post-war Poland were already feeling alienated by their increasing marginalization. In his work about Herder and other writings by Emil Adler from the 1960s, one can catch a glimpse of the various stages of his thought, of Adler's thought, both the figurative Cheder boy reading Spinoza for the first time, beginning to question his childhood faith, and a disillusioned Marxist who had placed his faith in man and human beings, only to be disappointed. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that broad-ranging and very revealing account. Somebody has written that all history is autobiography. I think from Emil Adler's autobiography one can learn a great deal about the history of 20th century Poland. As I said earlier, you have agreed to answer questions, and so I welcome questions from the floor, observations on the points which Karen made in this lecture.
Thank you very much for this excellent lecture. You have mentioned, when introducing the history of emotions, you distinguished between the psychological and sociological perspective on it, and that you sympathize more with the sociological one. Could you please elaborate a little bit on the distinction?
Sure. The way that I would refer to sort of emotional history as social history would be to look at like practices, everyday practices, language, like sort of concrete, rather than speculating, right, on, rather than speculating on how somebody feels, looking concretely at sort of manifestations, right, of either what somebody actually writes, what emotions they themselves describe, or the kinds of practices in everyday life, like sort of code words or secret meeting places or slang, things like concrete details of everyday life that and how people react to them and how they describe what that means in their own lives, to understand kind of what creates bonds of community. So both looking at sort of concrete details of everyday life and, when possible, when there are sources, how they themselves describe what kind of need that fills for them, right? As opposed to speculating, like I'm writing right now about this diary I'm working with from the end of the 19th century, is a woman who's converting. And there's a lot of sort of speculation about why people convert. When I thought about sort of making a parallel analysis between she's converting to Catholicism and converting to communism, one can make this kind of argument. Deconverting, yeah. Rather than, there's a lot of sort of speculation about why people convert, but she actually is explaining concretely what she at least is identifying as her emotions, and then how those kinds of emotions shape her decision-making, which then shapes her life path, right? It's not sort of me speculating, it's looking at how she reconstructs her mindset. Does that answer your question?
If I could, please, there's somebody at the back here.
Nie wiem, czy pani będzie chciała odpowiedzieć na takie pytania, ale na przykład interesuje mnie, czy pani jest osobą wierzącą? Jeżeli tak, to jaka to wiara? Jakie są pani poglądy polityczne? Na kogo pani głosowała w ostatnich wyborach w Stanach? I co pani chce osiągnąć w życiu?
Come to speak into the mic.
Is that what you asked me, is who I voted for? Is that what I didn't vote for Trump. And I find, I find this sort of thinking about the history of emotions and how one can understand political processes and political decision-making on the part of individuals through the perspective of what kind of emotions it fills, actually helps me understand why some people vote, for Trump or other, like let's say in Poland or other countries, why people vote for whom they vote for. I don't think one can explain it only by economic explanations or I think that one has to take into account emotions. So I think that, that's a simple answer to your question.
Another part of the question was about your
about my religion?
Whether you're a believer.
Oh, I'm debating whether I should answer this, but why not? I'm not observant, and I'm not a believer, but neither am I an atheist, I suppose. I just sat Shiva, and the sort of ritual of mourning,
Died, yes.
and I wouldn't have done so. He was an atheist, and if I wouldn't have done so if I didn't have some kind of faith in something, right?
Well, I think we should get back to the real topic.
Thank you.
So, my question is really, you describe some of those circumstances, etc., and emotions, and it's very good that at the end you mentioned the conversion to Catholicism and conversion to communism as similar, because I think this was something lacking in the presentation, that to many of them, not all of course, but many of them, this was a sort of a quasi-religious approach. But my specific question is about something you mentioned about Walewski, Max Horwitz Walewski. And you said that he was one of the many Polish intellectuals in that movement who did become more conscious of Jewishness because of the problems he encountered when he was in prison. But the question is, was it really relevant? I mean, to his activities. How relevant it was to his later activities? I don't think it was relevant. Even though he may be more conscious, his emotions could have been more Jewish than of the other Polish intellectual communist or leftist leaders, then I don't think it was manifested in any way in his political, ideological, and activities. So the question is, what is really what follows? I mean, what is it important, or maybe is it? If so, why?
Okay, thank you for that question. I think that I did argue that, and not for Max Horwitz, but perhaps for other individuals who, you're talking about like whether the sort of involvement in or showing interest in one's Jewish background, moving back to one's Jewish background, whether it's relevant at all to one's political or sort of public intellectual ideas is the question that you're asking. Is that correct?
Yes, but in this case, because it depends on the individual.
Right. So I think that what I argued previously was not specifically about Max Horwitz, but about others that interest and involvement in things Jewish was a way of asserting a broad conception of Polishness. It was actually an expression of a sort of conception of Poland that could include ethnic, national, religious minorities, right? Now, I think I would also look at the role of disillusionment and loneliness and alienation, these sort of feelings of alienation, loneliness, and disillusionment, and other sort of emotional or other feelings resulting from wanting to be part of a society that then rejects them in understanding political worldviews. I don't think that looking back, we can separate them, but I don't think that anybody can separate one's personal and political views entirely. There's always an interplay. I think the challenge is in doing so in a period in the past that we didn't ourselves live in, and for individuals who are not ourselves. I think that that there's always an interplay. The challenge is accessing it.
Please.
I would like to understand more about the explanatory value of the concept of emotion, as you understand it. Is the concept, does it explain the reason for action, or is it the outcome of action? In what way does it broaden our perspective? And further on, if it does add to our understanding of action, then I'm not sure, I'm just thinking aloud, I'm not sure whether it could explain the evolution of organizational affiliation, say, for youngsters starting as Hashomer Hatzair and evolving, and maybe at the end of the process landing in the Communist Party.
Yeah.
Would this concept mean that the emotional that the belonging as such would belonging as such explain this evolution? Would it mean that the highest emotional value was received by such individuals at the end of the process? Would it then serve as an explanation for the evolution? I'm just looking for a perspective.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Schatz, for that. Professor Schatz, yes, I can't see that well, but I think that is you. Thank you for that question. So I'm at the sort of beginning of asking these questions, and I don't have them worked out. It sort of was a way of rethinking through my previous research. However, I'm not trying to make a connection between sort of emotions and intellectual history. I'm more looking at looking at how communities, or how as sort of emotional communities, not necessarily about thought, but about sort of concrete social practices that fulfilled a particular need. So, for example, and again, I'm immersed right now in a very different topic, but immersing myself in a woman who clearly expresses over and over again the feeling of alienation. And if I were reading a diary of an individual, a communist who was going through a process of disillusionment or alienation, looking at what the community of sort of political activists, what kind of, let's put it differently, like what a youth group, a political youth group, someone who, like Stanisława Spiegelman or Stanisława Krutz, she begins with a Zionist, with I think it was Hashomer Hatzair, and then she becomes a socialist and then a communist. Rather than trying to understand sort of the evolution in her politics only through sort of intellectual thought, looking at what that concrete group of people did concretely for her life at the time, as a social circle, as sort of an emotional, a group of people who shared common emotional needs, and who developed practices of where they met and how often they met and what they read together, who created a sort of, bonds of family, of community together, that didn't necessarily have anything to do with political difference, right? So I'm not trying to make a connection between sort of one's emotions and one's thought, but between emotions and the social practices that a group of people involved in similar political activities kind of explore together or share in common.
He wants the later, okay. I have a problem that started to appear after I heard for the first time your lecture some 10 years ago, I think. It was in the conference in the Palace of Culture, the IPN the conference. When I described it to my colleagues from the 68 immigration, I got a letter saying, how representative is a house of 18 sort of Jewish families to 30,000 Jews living in Poland, mainly in Dzierżoniów, Bielawa, Wrocław, Pietrolesie, and working in a co-ops as cobblers and whatever. and belonging to the Communist Party. And as you probably know, out of the 30,000, about 8,000 were members of the SKZ, which was clearly connected with communist organization. Although, well, say half of them were just vaguely reading the Yiddish paper and not really believing in what they were told by the, various organizers. But it wasn't, this is not representative to the society, the Jewish small society that was completely broken in '68.
Okay, thank you. I think this is Mr. Sobol. I thought so. I recall it's good to see you, and thank you for your comments. A couple of thoughts in response. The first is that these families are not representative. They are, first of all, definitely not representative of Poland as a whole. And initially, I don't know if Professor Polonsky remembers this, my initial dissertation proposal was to compare Wałbrzych, a neighborhood in Wałbrzych, with several buildings in Warsaw. And I wanted to go into greater depth about each family then it would not have been possible if I had maintained that broad perspective. However, what I do argue is that because these families who are not representative, because they are communists, right, because they are pre-war communists, because they welcomed ideology into their home, because they were true believers in terms of communism, that the impact on their families and on their children exaggerated developments, and also sort of the impact on their own lives and identities and communities exaggerated phenomena that impacted the broader population, specifically in Warsaw. So that they're not representative, but because they welcomed politics, because their ideology, they brought this ideology into their home, the impact on networks of families, in schools, friendships, on their children's identities, exaggerated aspects that influence the broader population. I would highly recommend Katka, what is Katka's last name? No, she writes about Czech Republic and Poland. Czapkova has written about Western Poland in a way that I think, we have to have both aspects, right, in order to have one full picture. And so I don't disagree with your comments. I just would say that I'm not making an argument that sort of microhistory doesn't need to be representative in order to be relevant. And throughout my book, I didn't just research these families. I sat in IPN and in Teskazet archives and in many other archives for a long time, reconstructing the sort of macro-historical background in order to situate this particular case study, really, in a broader context, in order to show what was common, what was exceptional. I don't think you can have microhistory without macro historical backdrop. So thank you for your question and comments.
I'm afraid that you are making a absolutization of the concept emotional attitude. The old Stagirite, Aristoteles says that intellect moves nothing by itself. And nothing is happening without emotion. So this is not a discovery about the emotions. Secondly, those emotions could to lead the people involved not only to communism, also to fascism, also to there were Jewish fascists also, revisionists, rightists, and it's not a characteristic feature of communism that he moved emotionally. So I think that we have to look after the special causes that caused to Jews communists.
So I'll address the second part of your comments first, because I understood that clearly. I agree with you that these emotions are not only emotions that communists had. I don't think the research has been done to understand. I think what I'm saying is that research needs to be done to understand why, to understand why certain people are drawn to certain political movements. Here we're talking about leftist politics. In order to understand decision-making, in order to understand sort of political culture. And we don't, I would tend to agree with the assumption that you made that people who are drawn to right-wing fascist political movements also have similar emotions, but we haven't done the research. And those who have researched other political cultures have actually found that looking at political decision-making and political patterns and political cultures through the lens of through this lens of the history of emotions have expanded our understanding of why people become involved in particular political groups. We haven't done the research. I think I haven't done the research yet either, sort of more asking questions.
I think that this is a good point at which to conclude this very interesting and important discussion. I'd like again on your behalf to thank Karen for this very stimulating presentation.